What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. John, I don't want you to go nuclear on me in this episode, please.
I think we need some nuclear power here. Keep us going.
First there was no nukes. Now there are some nukes, but some of these nukes aren't being maintained because, well, they can't figure out the economics of nuclear power anymore. And John, it's kind of shocking when you think about it, that around the world, a lot of industrialized nations have really glommed on to nuclear power as a way to go carbon less. And we haven't. France, of course, we've heard that they've really bought into nuclear.
Well, they have these new nuclear, they're like drop-in plants now that are supposed to be very, very safe, very small, and they can, provide us power. So I don't know, I'm kind of, on one hand, it seems to make a lot of sense. On the other hand, we still haven't figured out where to store the waste.
Yeah, the waste is an issue. We do get into this on the episode that we're about to bring you with Rich Powell. He is the executive director of the ClearPath Foundation. Now, let me tell you a little bit about them. They're a nonprofit group. They promote conservative, clean energy solutions. And he is a big proponent of nuclear, and he talks about just what you said, John, that there are new technologies. But, any industry, for it to look at these new technologies and adopt them, you have to prove that there is a viability to the market. And we heard about this nuclear renaissance a couple of years ago, a couple of plants that were going to be built, and I don't think they've ever really gone online.
Yeah, well, you had Fukushima.
That kind of took the wind out of the sails, if you will. And I think a lot of Americans still think about Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. Those are very difficult to get out of our minds, right?
No, they are. That's what, stuff you got to think about, how really dangerous these plants can be if they're not maintained or something goes wrong.
Well, that's what's always worried me because, John, we live in a state where we rely upon nuclear power. I think 50% of our electric output comes from nuclear, and yet we've taken certain plants offline. We've been told by Dominion, which is a big operator, that they can't make it. They need help from the state. And so you really begin to wonder how viable going forward is this particular market. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. We got, up here we've kind of got hydro coming from Canada, which can provide us a lot of green power. And, of course, solar is getting bigger. So, I don't know, it's tough to say. Like I said, I'm kind of on the wall with nuclear because I understand it's really, it's a simple way to provide power for a lot of people, but you got the waste problem, and you got the danger. Supposedly, the new plants are a lot less hazardous than the old ones.
Oh, absolutely. They've really done a lot, but I don't think America has yet kept up with that. And don't forget, in the middle of this, because you talked about where we're going with solar, and clearly, I think ClearPath Foundation and others, hey, that's great. And so is wind, but it's intermittent.
Right.
Whereas nuclear, you can rely upon it. The problem is that natural gas came along, and it made a lot of the economics for these other alternatives to go with a less carbon footprint. It has become the transition fuel. So a lot of other things have stalled in the wake of this great, onrush to natural gas.
Yeah, I don't know. You see, natural gas, and that's pumped out of the ground. I don't know. You got to figure it out, your price per kilowatt hour and how much it's going to cost, and is it worth investing in these plants.
And what about the implications of fracking? I mean, there's so many
Exactly.
elements to this. I think you bring up the one that has been on my mind about the hazardous waste or the low-level waste and the storage and everybody keeping it all around the country. We've had that debate about Yucca Mountain. We talk about that, of course, today. So we wanted to explore in this episode, what is the future, if any, of nuclear power in America? Is the technology getting a lot cheaper and safer? And I think it's fair to say that it is, like every other industry today. But whether we have really, at least from a perception standpoint, overcome some of the concerns that people have, that I don't know, John.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what it leaves me wondering.
Absolutely. Well, let's get on to Rich Powell, Executive Director of the ClearPath Foundation, and I think he can give us some great insights. Well, on the line with us is Rich Powell. He is the Executive Director of ClearPath Foundation, a nonprofit that promotes conservative clean energy solutions. We've been doing a lot about clean energy and carbon footprint and the like. And we asked Rich to come by because he had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and he was squaring off with another gentleman about nuclear power and whether it has a robust future in the U.S. And Rich, you were on the affirmative side of that debate. Why don't you make your case for nuclear power?
Sure. So what I said in the article and what we believe at ClearPath is that nuclear is a need to have for America's future, not a nice to have. So first and foremost, America must be a nuclear power simply because of national security reasons. We need a thriving civilian nuclear sector so that we have a thriving military nuclear sector because that's simply necessary for a superpower in this day and age. And then in addition to just that military sector, nations around the world are going to continue to build and deploy nuclear power plants. So the key question you have to ask yourself is, do you want those to be U.S. nuclear power plants with all of the high technology and safeguards that come along with that, or do you want them to be Russian and Chinese nuclear power plants with the lower safeguards and the worst technology and the lower safety that comes along with all of that? And so for us, then the answer becomes pretty clear. The United States has got to be a nuclear leader. And then if we layer on the concern you just talked about, which is the concern of carbon emissions, nuclear power is just absolutely essential to power a world in a low-carbon future. If you look at the few countries, the few big advanced countries that have ever actually made the transition all the way to clean energy, there aren't many. It's really just France and Sweden. They did that on the back of nuclear energy. Every other approach that people talk about is an untested one. And we hope they work, we really do, but nuclear is the sort of the tested, tried and true way. We already have a remarkable nuclear power fleet in the United States, about 20% of our current power, 100 reactors, but it is an aging fleet. We do need a new generation of technology to come on board and replace and expand that fleet. But the good news is there's a whole suite of American innovators that have taken on that very challenge. Bill Gates has put a massive investment into a company called TerraPower that's planning to test a reactor here in the United States in association with Southern Company, the big utility down in the Southeast, and also a different reactor over in China. And then you have a number of smaller, scrappier, venture-backed startups like Oklo that's working on very small reactors that could be built in a factory and then shipped to a remote island or a remote village or a mining site or something like that. So you have a lot of venture capital, you have a lot of innovation, smart young people moving into the space, really all because of the carbon-free, zero-emissions aspect of nuclear
But that
power.
somewhat belies what has been happening. We've seen 6 reactors in recent years that have had their licenses expire. We've seen that some of the projections that were made about a decade ago about nuclear power have not really come to be. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was prepared to receive dozens of applications to build new reactors. So what is the current state of the industry here in the United States?
So what you're saying is absolutely right. There are a number of these older nuclear plants, most of them that are operating in our competitive wholesale power markets that have begun to close prematurely, and that's due purely to economic pressures. We've had this amazing resurgence of U.S. natural gas production, and it has driven market prices very, very low, and that's been challenging for a number of nuclear power plants in the wholesale fleet to respond to and to get through. And that's also driven a lot of folks to not build the very large reactors that they had expected to back in what we refer to as the nuclear renaissance. That was kind of after the 2005 energy bill, when we had all this new policy to facilitate nuclear energy. And so you see a couple of different things going on there, right? So the current generation of nuclear power plants, in just a pure economic sense, when you don't take into account any of their other benefits, just how cheaply can they produce, a unit of electricity, frankly, they're not competitive right now with natural gas if you don't take into account a number of other things like their resilience and their clean profile and other things. Natural gas is just a remarkable and a very cheap way to produce electricity. Of course, it has some drawbacks, right, like the fact that natural gas pipelines could be disrupted in a way that nuclear plants can't. And natural gas does have significant emissions of both carbon and other criteria pollutants. But currently, our market is not set up to take any of that into account. So there are changes that are being proposed now to the wholesale power markets that would take some of those factors into account, particularly the resilience of the nuclear fleet. And we're supportive of changes like that compensate nuclear for that special characteristic. We think if that happened, nuclear plants actually would look a whole lot better and might be fully competitive against gas. And then on your second question there about why the new plants building stopped, frankly, it's because we don't need these gigantic gigawatt scale plants at this point in this country. We have power demand that's pretty flat, and the plants that are succeeding now in the United States are sort of smaller, faster, lighter, quicker to build. A lot of the advanced reactor developers are targeting plants like that are cheaper in the first place and that can also be put together a whole lot more quickly, that don't take a decade or more to permit and construct. And so we think that once nuclear has a more competitive offering like that, there's no fundamental reason that it won't be able to compete in the free market.
When we look at what is called a clean energy portfolio, and many states, differ in terms of their interpretation of that, and tell me whether the federal government really gets involved to say, well, it's solar, it's wind, it's hydro, perhaps, again, and it's nuclear, or whether nuclear is generally sculpted out of that conversation.
Well, at the federal level, and in many states, it certainly is sculpted out of the conversation. The federal government, for example, has renewable procurement standards when it's buying electricity for the gigantic federal fleet of buildings. And in that renewable procurement standard, really, they just mean wind and solar. In fact, they really don't even mean hydropower.
Oh, really? That's it? Okay.
Yeah, it's not considered a renewable. And of course, that entirely cuts out nuclear, right? And so these are decisions that were made at a very different time in our country's history, when renewables were primarily being looked at because they were a source of fully domestic power, right? And you have to remember, people have been advocating for renewables from long before anybody, was worried about the risk of carbon, right? The climate thing sort of came later as an argument for renewables. So if what you're really trying to do is diversify the American power supply, then, I can understand you'd do a renewable standard of some kind. But these things have really kind of grown kind of far beyond that. And they're now being justified because they, incentivize zero emissions power, when in fact they really just pick winners and losers amongst technologies. We're much more in favor of performance-based technology neutral, if you're going to do that sort of thing. So, if what you want is zero carbon power, say it's a zero carbon permitting, standard, not a renewable or wind and solar kind of procurement standard.
Now, when we look at renewable energy costs, they have fallen pretty considerably, and even more than was projected. But you remind us in your piece in the Wall Street Journal that the problem with them is that they are intermittent, and of course nuclear power is not. It's continuous.
Yes, that's right. Wind and solar are terrific technologies, and they've come, in an enormous way in the past few decades. They're now, I think, properly seen as sort of mature, real technologies that can add meaningfully to our power mix. But in the end, we do need a mix, right? If what we need is a power portfolio that can respond to our power load, our demand for power, which is different at different times of the day and sometimes varies sharply. So we really need a set of dispatchable clean energy technologies that can serve all that load at all these different times. And until we have some enormous breakthrough in the cost of energy storage, and I don't mean the minor kinds of things that are now being discussed with lithium-ion batteries, but entirely new kinds of storage that can be scaled up to huge sizes at a tiny fraction of the current price. Wind and solar is not going to be able to do it alone. You never know; those things might one day happen, but they're on nobody's near-term technology horizon. And so until then, we're certainly going to need these other technologies. And we may well find that advanced nuclear technologies, in fact, are even more powerful and less costly than even those combinations.
Well, when we go back to your example of France, for instance, explain to us why they have been so willing and anxious to embrace nuclear power, what they have done, why there's such investment, how much the government is involved, and what will it take in the U.S. to jumpstart even a much leaner and different kind of operation for nuclear that has both private and public investment?
That's a great question. So France did this in a very different setting, and it wasn't motivated by clean energy concerns. So France was heavily dependent in the 70s and 80s on oil-fired generation, and of course that was our period of a number of major oil shocks. And they effectively decided to diversify their power portfolio away from something that would be subjected to all these foreign oil supply shocks. And so they said, well, we're just going to do entirely domestic power. And at the time, if it was entirely domestic, it was going to be nuclear power. They had sort of complete control over that. And so this was a major public sector effort. So government got heavily involved in the building of those plants. And both the power company and the engineering company that supplied that company are big government-owned enterprises. So these are EDF and Areva. And so in France, it's been a very government-heavy situation, very different than anything you'd imagine, and certainly that we would advocate for in the United States. It's also had significant drawbacks, right? They've made enormous progress on building that fleet. They now have some of the cheapest power in Europe, but their ability to build new power plants in other parts of the world on time and on budget seems to be quite limited, at least at the moment.
You pointed out that one of the reasons that nuclear power perhaps has stalled in relation to the lowering of the price of natural gas is the fact that electricity demand, which back in 2005 was expected to grow about 2% a year, but it has really lagged in the period because of slower economic growth. If, in fact, one of the mantras of the current administration is economic growth, then tie that together with the need for more generation and where nuclear might fit in that scenario.
So certainly a way to spur more power demand would be to get the economy growing faster again. So if we got up to a 3 or 4% economic growth, you could imagine power, maybe not that 2% a year, but I mean even a 1 or north of that percent growth in power demand every year, combined with what will come, which is just a natural retirement of the fleet of older plants that we have, that will leave a lot of room for new plants. So there is a lot of opportunity, especially in the sort of 10 to 20 year time horizon, to build new, even very large plants. There's going to be a market opportunity for something to come in and win during that time, especially if we can make growth take off.
Do you think that as a society we're looking at the true costs of carbon, fossil fuels, and whether that's really factored in when it's competing with nuclear power, for example?
Well, we don't currently factor that in. There's no incentive given across the board for clean energy generation. This is another example, especially at the federal government, of sort of picking winners and losers. So we have incentives for new solar generation and new wind generation, which effectively take into account its clean energy characteristics and sort of give it a leg up. We don't have anything like that for existing nuclear generation, and right now we're struggling to even reform and extend an incentive that would cover new nuclear generation. So that's actually been a live issue in comprehensive tax reform. An extension of a measure called the 45J tax credit for advanced nuclear was included in the House bill, not in the Senate bill. And so it'll be an active topic in the conference coming up of those two bills together on whether that can be extended for nuclear as well.
The public support for nuclear power, it is not terribly high when you look at public opinion polls. What is it that the industry or advocates need to do to get people feeling more comfortable with nuclear power?
That's a great question. So typically nuclear power, public support has been highest when people are feeling some kind of stress about other types of energy. And right now, they really don't feel that stress. Gas prices are historically low. Power prices in many parts of the country are historically low. Gasoline prices, because of low oil prices, are all low. So people aren't feeling like, oh, we need this alternative in nuclear. And I think not enough people realize just how clean and special nuclear generation is. I mean, if you poll some folks, they'll still say, actually, well, nuclear is an emitting power source. It's not a clean power source, just like other things. So I do think that the industry needs to do a better job of educating people on those benefits. And I would say, for heaven's sake, the industry needs to stop talking about how safe the plants are, right? That's the core concern that some people have about nuclear plants. But when you get onto an airplane, nobody ever says, well, this is the safest airplane you're ever going to fly on, right? We put that aside. We just sort of expect safety. And there's some lingering concern from a lot of folks about the safety of nuclear power plants. That needs to be put aside. These plants are extraordinarily safe. And now, of course, here I go and sort of...
Well, you mentioned core, and I don't want to use that term in any sense that people might be worried, because we've seen a lot of the movies and representations of nuclear, and we've seen some real-life incidents. But let me take you back to where we're emanating from here in the state of Connecticut. We are reliant about 50% on nuclear power, and yet some of our plants are closed down. A lot of debate this year about how much of a subsidy these plants that are still alive are going to need to be able to compete, at least in this period when natural gas is so low. And so there are a lot of us who are a little bit nervous with 50% reliance. So in a sense, we're a little different. We're over-reliant on nuclear energy.
Well, I think, over or under, that's all sort of that's a value-laden judgment, right? When I think about what power sources it would be fine to be highly reliant on, France and Sweden have comfortably, worked at well above that. The province of Quebec has worked at well above that now for decades, supplied by nuclear power. And all of these places have, sort of clean, reliable, very inexpensive sources of power. So, I think we really need to think about this more in terms of, do we have a balance of attributes as opposed to do we have a balance of fuel? Right. So
well, I say over-reliant only because there's been a lot of question about the maintenance of these facilities. Some have had to close down. Their relationship to Long Island Sound, where they get a lot of their source of power and so forth. So, I mean, just there are a number of questions about that. The other question that is lingering here in the United States is, what are we going to do with all this waste? And keeping it at the site as opposed to moving it to Yucca Mountain. And this seems to be a debate that has stalled. Where is that today here in the United States?
Well, we finally have some movement, thankfully, on that debate. So folks may remember that Senator Reid from Nevada was a staunch opponent of the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository, and obviously in a very powerful position as Majority Leader of the Senate there for a while. And so was sort of effectively able to block the further build out of that project, and that sort of blocked up the whole process of getting waste off of the sites of these plants. Now, the first thing you note is just there's really nothing wrong with the waste being there at the site, right there. It's completely safe. It's not endangering anyone to have it on those sites, but one can understand why it all needs a more permanent home. In this new Congress, a large bipartisan majority has been very supportive of legislation to restart the construction of the Yucca Mountain site. And so that now seems like we've finally started to unclog that process, and we may well be on the road to a permanent repository that could take the vast majority of this waste that's currently stored around the country.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well,
Not
you can
us,
direct
though. We
message
have real
us
news.
at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And you know, John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. What about the movement of that waste if we were to all send it to Nevada? Are you concerned at all about the movement of it?
I'm not at all concerned. You don't realize this, but much more intense nuclear material is moved around the country all the time by the military, and it's done so entirely safely, and there's never been an incident. So, moving much lower grade civilian stuff around the country gives us no concern.
Okay. When we talk about advanced nuclear energy technologies, and you addressed it in your piece, you're telling us that there really are some incredible technologies available to us today that will have a shelf life perhaps less than some of the plants today, but much different in the nature of the technology that's used. Explain that to us, the future, and what it really does look like.
Sure. Well, so the biggest and most important thing is that the current generation of nuclear plants available in the United States and around the world are these really large plants. So the things that are being built right now down in Georgia, the two Westinghouse AP1000 plants, are each gigawatt scale nuclear reactors. So, these are gigantic. They effectively can power whole cities themselves. That, however, is kind of not what the market wants right now for a variety of reasons. It takes a long time to build something like that. As we've talked about, the power demand just isn't there for that much. And the amount of capital required to build plants like that means that a company has to raise sometimes $6, $7, $8, even $10 billion to build one of these things. Whereas right now, the capital markets are much more likely to push into things that are smaller and quicker to build and quicker to deploy. And so this new generation of technologies, for a variety of reasons, is what folks refer to as an SMR, a small modular reactor. So the sizes are much smaller, and much more of it can be built off-site in a factory and then shipped and sort of more bolted together than the previous reactors, which were more like built on site, like you were building a stadium or a bridge or some massive project like that. So these new generations of reactors all do that, and a number of them also have some other really interesting characteristics. Probably the most interesting one for folks that are really concerned about carbon is that a lot of them run very hot. And the reason that that's important is we have to remember, if you think that carbon is a problem, it's not just the power sector that produces carbon. Lots of other sectors also emit that stuff. And one of the biggest sectors that emit it is the industrial sector, where they use a huge amount of heat in order to do things like refine oil into gasoline and other petrochemicals, where they use heat to melt iron and coking coal into steel, and all these other industrial processes that are just essential for modern life. And unless we have a way to produce enormous amounts of heat without any emissions, we're never going to be able to take all the emissions away from those big industrial sectors. So a lot of these advanced nuclear plant concepts are helpful not only because they produce power, but because they could produce zero-emission heat.
I found it very interesting in your piece that you said perhaps some of these new plants that you envision, and they're less than 1% the size of traditional reactors, could actually be deployed in places like Puerto Rico to really restart their grid in a much quicker way. That would give people some hope that the nuclear industry could actually really acclimate to environmental situations that are real world and very difficult for us to accomplish in any other way.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to remember, our country actually has a large fleet of these very small reactors. It's our naval fleet, right? A number of our aircraft carriers and many, many of our submarines already have small modular nuclear reactors on board, and we flexibly deploy them all over the world at a moment's notice, right? They're not tied down to anything. You could imagine very similar things being built in shipping containers, right, with all of their fuel inside, and those things just being shipped wherever they need to be to power whatever kind of circumstance we need.
When do you see, in closing, nuclear, when it is the largest source of carbon-free electricity, really not being replaced as it is today by gas and perhaps even coal, as this administration seems to want to go back to coal? When do you see that day when nuclear is really going to replace, old nuclear is going to be replaced by new nuclear?
It may be sooner than we think, and that's because the Chinese may beat us to it. So they're also experimenting with a number of these advanced reactors. They'll actually likely have a prototype for one of them, what's called a high-temperature gas reactor, up and running either by the end of this year or early next year. And if things like that work and the Chinese are able to start deploying them very quickly, it may well just be a question of whether the U.S. industry can even keep up in a new industry that is already well on its way in the early 2020s.
Rich Powell, thank you for joining us today on America Trends.
Thank you for having me.